Imagine sitting in a courtroom in 1875, watching a woman read your letters out loud. Every word you once whispered to her in private, now read aloud to strangers, to a judge, to a room full of people taking notes. Imagine that this was not shameful for her to do. Imagine it was, for a time, one of the only ways a woman could fight back. In parts of England and America, a broken engagement could cost a man more than his pride. It could cost him money, sometimes thousands of dollars, in a time when a laborer might earn less than $1 a day. A promise to marry was, quietly, a kind of contract, and contracts, when broken, could be taken to court. Hi friends. Tonight we're going somewhere gentle and a little unusual, into old courtrooms, old letters, and old heartbreaks. If you're settling in for sleep, this is a good moment to dim the lights. Pull a blanket up around your shoulders and let your eyes rest, even if you keep listening. Tonight's story is about breach of promise. About a kind of lawsuit that doesn't exist anymore, not in the way it once did, but that, for almost 2 centuries, quietly shaped the lives of women who had nowhere else to turn. Let's ease into it slowly. Picture a small town somewhere in the English countryside, sometime in the 1840s. The roads are narrow and rutted, the kind that turn to soft mud after rain. You can hear cartwheels creaking somewhere in the distance, and a dog barking twice, then falling quiet. The air smells like wood smoke and damp wool. In a house near the edge of town, a young woman named, let's call her Eliza, though of course there were thousands like her, sits by a window mending a shirt. Her needle moves slowly, steadily, the way it has every evening for the past 2 years. She is not mending it for her father. She is mending it for the man she believes she is going to marry. His name doesn't matter. What matters is the promise. He gave her a ring once, nothing grand, just a thin band of gold, the kind a clerk or a shopkeeper's son might afford. He gave her letters too, dozens of them, folded into small squares and tied with ribbon, kept in a drawer beneath her handkerchiefs. In one of them he wrote that he could not imagine his life without her. In another he asked her to wait just a little longer until his situation improved. She waited. This is worth pausing on, because waiting in the 19th century was not a small thing for a woman. An engagement was understood, by neighbors and family alike, as a kind of soft marriage, not yet legal, but socially real. A woman who was engaged did not attend certain dances. She did not accept the attentions of other men. She spent her evenings preparing linens, sometimes for years, quietly building the beginnings of a household that did not yet exist. You can almost hear it, can't you? The particular sound of a needle pulling thread through cotton, over and over, in a quiet room lit by a single candle. Outside, perhaps, church bells mark the hour, soft and distant, the way old bells always sound a little like they're underwater. And then, one day, the letters stop, not dramatically, not with a single terrible announcement, just slowly. A week without word becomes 2 weeks, 2 weeks becomes a month. And then, somehow through a cousin or a shopkeeper or a passing bit of gossip, Eliza learns that the man she was to marry has become engaged to someone else, someone with more money perhaps, or simply someone new. There is no scene here, no shouting, no slammed door. That is not how these stories usually went. The heartbreak arrived quietly, the way most real heartbreak does, through silence, through absence, through the particular emptiness of a chair that used to be filled. But here is the part that might surprise you, tucked gently into an otherwise ordinary tragedy. Eliza did not simply have to accept this. She could sue him. It sounds almost strange to say aloud, doesn't it? A lawsuit for a broken heart. But breach of promise to marry was, for a very long stretch of history, a genuine legal claim, recognized by courts in England and later across much of the United States. If a man promised to marry a woman and then broke that promise without a sufficiently serious reason, she could take him to civil court and sue him for damages. Let that sit for a moment, softly, the way you might let a warm cup of tea sit in your hands before drinking. In a world where women often could not own property in their own name, could not vote, could not easily pursue most professions, here was one narrow door left slightly open. A door marked simply, breach of contract, because that is exactly how the law understood it. Not romance, Not heartbreak, not officially. A promise to marry was treated, in the language of the courts, the same way a promise to deliver goods might be treated, or a promise to pay a debt. If you agreed to marry someone and you failed to follow through, you had broken an agreement, and agreements broken could be compensated. It's a strange kind of comfort, really, wrapped inside something so practical. The heart dressed up in legal language, grief translated into contract law. You can imagine the local solicitor's office, where a woman like Eliza might have gone. A narrow room, shelves crowded with leather-bound ledgers, dust drifting slow and golden in a shaft of afternoon light, the scratch of a quill on paper, the solicitor listening patiently, asking careful questions. Did he give you gifts? Did he write to you? Did others hear him call you his intended? Because those details mattered enormously. A breach of promise case did not rest on feelings alone. Courts required evidence that the promise itself had truly been made and had been broken without just cause. And so women kept things, ribbons, rings, and most of all, letters. Letters were, in many ways, the beating heart of these lawsuits. In a time before recorded phone calls, before texts, before anything we would recognize as digital proof, a letter was one of the few tangible records of a private intention. A man's handwriting, his own words, describing his feelings and his plans. These were treasured not only for sentiment, but because they might, one day, need to be produced as evidence. There is something quietly poignant in imagining a young woman keeping every letter a suitor ever sent her, not entirely out of romance, but out of a kind of careful foresight. Tucked into a small wooden box, perhaps, alongside a pressed flower or two and a lock of hair tied with thread, the ordinary keepsakes of courtship, doubling, without ever being spoken of that way, as a modest little file of evidence. If a case went to trial, those letters might be read aloud in open court by lawyers in front of a room full of strangers. Every tender word, every clumsy declaration of devotion, exposed for public hearing. It must have been an odd, mixed feeling, the private made painfully public, in exchange for the chance at justice, or at least at compensation. Picture the courtroom itself. Wooden benches worn smooth by decades of restless waiting, tall windows letting in pale, indifferent daylight, the low murmur of spectators who had come frankly for the drama of it. Breach of promise trials were, in their own quiet way, entertainment. Newspapers loved them. A jilted bride, a wealthy or well-known defendant, a stack of intimate letters, read solemnly by a barrister. These cases sold papers the way little else could, and so there is a strange doubling in this history, a legal tool that offered women real recourse, wrapped inside a public spectacle that could feel almost as exposing as the original heartbreak. Still, women used it, again and again, for generations. Let's slow down here for a moment, the way you might slow your breathing before sleep. Think about what this lawsuit actually protected. Not love. Courts were careful never to pretend they were adjudicating love. What breach of promise protected, in practical terms, was a woman's reputation and her economic prospects. In a world where a woman's chief path to financial security ran through marriage, a broken engagement was not simply an emotional wound. It could be a genuine financial catastrophe if Eliza had turned down other suitors while waiting for her fiancé, and she likely had, since an engaged woman was expected to do exactly that. Then his abandonment did not just break her heart. It cost her years. Years in which other, perhaps less desirable, offers might have come and gone. Years in which she aged, in the eyes of a society that measured a woman's marriageability partly by youth. A broken engagement, especially a public one, could mark a woman as somehow tainted, jilted, damaged goods, in the cruel shorthand of the era, making future proposals harder to come by. There is a particular, quiet unfairness folded into all of this. A man who broke an engagement might feel embarrassment, might endure some gossip, but his prospects for marriage and standing usually recovered quickly enough. A woman in the same position often could not say the same. The law, in its narrow way, seemed to recognize this asymmetry, which is precisely why damages in these cases were sometimes so substantial. Courts occasionally awarded sums equivalent to years of a working person's wages, an acknowledgement, however imperfect, that something real and lasting had been taken. You can almost picture the moment a verdict was read. The courtroom hushed, the creak of benches as people leaned forward, a number spoken aloud, perhaps £500, perhaps $1,000. Sums that would feel almost fantastical to Eliza and women like her, who had spent years counting pennies for household linens. And somewhere outside, evening settling in, church bells ringing the hour once more, indifferent to whatever had just happened inside those walls. It's worth remembering gently that not every story ended in a courtroom at all. For every case that went to trial, countless more were settled quietly, a discreet payment offered before matters became public, a private arrangement brokered by families eager to avoid scandal. The mere threat of a lawsuit, the mere existence of that stack of letters in a wooden box, was sometimes enough. There is something almost soothing in that thought, if you sit with it long enough. A quiet, unspoken understanding that a woman was not simply without power, that somewhere in her possession, in a drawer, in a ribbon-tied bundle, she held a kind of leverage the world rarely offered her elsewhere, still tired from waiting, still holding those letters, still in her own quiet way, protected by them. But not every woman's story unfolded so gently. There was one particular kind of case, the ones involving very public figures, very large sums, and very determined women, that the newspapers of the era simply could not resist. And it's in one of those cases, in a courtroom far grander than any small-town solicitor's office, that our story turns next. You were promised something at the end of the last section, a courtroom far grander than any small solicitor's office, a case so public that newspapers couldn't look away. So let's step into it now. Picture London, sometime in the 1860s. Not a quiet village this time, but a city, the kind with fog thick enough to blur gas lamps into soft orange halos, the clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestone, newsboys calling out headlines on street corners with a kind of theatrical urgency, and one particular headline, repeated for weeks, was simple: a breach of promise trial, involving a gentleman of considerable means and a woman determined to be heard. Court records from this era show something remarkable. Trials like these could draw crowds so large that additional seating had to be arranged, that people without any personal connection to either party would queue for hours simply to watch. It's a strange thing to imagine now, isn't it? Heartbreak as public entertainment, grief as theatre. But it happened, again and again, in courtrooms across England and America, throughout the 19th century. Let's settle in and imagine one such case together. Not any single documented trial exactly, but a composite drawn from the patterns historians have traced across dozens of similar proceedings. Patterns real enough that you could have found this exact scene playing out in any number of actual courthouses. The woman at the center of our story tonight, we'll call her Margaret, was not from a wealthy family. Her father worked as a schoolmaster, respected but modestly paid, in a market town a day's carriage ride from London. Margaret herself had a small talent for watercolor painting, and spent quiet afternoons sketching wildflowers pressed between the pages of her sketchbook. It's the kind of detail that tells you something, doesn't it? The particular gentleness of a life spent noticing small, unremarkable beauty. The man who courted her, we'll call him Mr. Ashworth, came from money, not extraordinary wealth, but enough that his family owned land, employed servants, and moved through society with the easy confidence that money provides. He met Margaret at a country dance, the kind held twice a year in the town's assembly rooms, candlelit and crowded, the air thick with the smell of beeswax candles and floor wax. You can imagine the sound of it, a small orchestra tuning their instruments, the rustle of silk and cotton skirts, careful conversation exchanged between dances, while chaperones watched from the edges of the room. Mr. Ashworth asked Margaret to dance twice that evening, which, in the strict etiquette of the time, was itself a small declaration. A gentleman did not dance twice with a lady, unless he intended something by it. Their courtship unfolded slowly over the following 2 years. Letters exchanged weekly, a handful of carefully chaperoned visits, small gifts sent at Christmas and on her birthday. At one point, Mr. Ashworth gave her a locket containing a small portrait of himself, painted by a local miniaturist. In his letters, preserved later as court evidence, he wrote of their future, together with what the judge would later describe as unambiguous intention. A phrase that, in the dry language of the law, meant simply, he had promised to marry her, clearly and repeatedly, in writing. And then, as so often happened, his family intervened. It's worth pausing here to notice something about how these stories so often unfolded. Not through villainy exactly, but through a kind of quiet social calculation. Mr. Ashworth's parents, it seems, had grown concerned about the modesty of Margaret's family fortune. A schoolmaster's daughter, however charming, however accomplished with a paintbrush, brought no land, no substantial dowry, nothing that would meaningfully expand the family's holdings. And so, gently but firmly, his parents began introducing him to other young women, the daughters of merchants and minor landowners, women whose families could offer something more concrete than affection. Margaret, for her part, seems to have sensed the shift before it was ever announced to her directly. His letters grew shorter, his visits less frequent. There's something almost universal in that particular ache, isn't there? The slow dawning realization that someone's attention is quietly draining away, long before anyone says the words out loud. The final blow, when it came, arrived through a newspaper announcement rather than a private letter. An engagement notice, printed plainly among the society pages, informing Margaret and the rest of the county that Mr. Ashworth was to marry a Miss Caroline Whitfield, daughter of a prosperous wool merchant. You can imagine the particular cruelty of that. Learning of your own abandonment not through a private word, but through print, alongside advertisements for hats and announcements of church fetes, a public humiliation delivered in the most ordinary possible packaging. But Margaret did not simply retreat into private grief. She went to a solicitor. The case that followed became, in its own modest way, something of a local sensation. Margaret's solicitor built her claim around exactly the evidence we discussed earlier: the letters, the locket, witnesses who had seen the two of them together at dances and church socials, all testifying, in their small ways, to the reality of the promise that had been made and broken. When the trial opened, the courtroom was, as court records from similar cases describe, uncomfortably full. Spectators pressed along the walls. Reporters from at least 2 regional newspapers took careful notes, preparing columns that would run for days afterward under headlines designed to sell copies. Phrases about broken hearts and betrayed trust, dressed up with just enough restraint to seem respectable. Margaret herself, according to the patterns these trials commonly followed, would have been required to sit through the reading of her own private letters. Words never intended for a courtroom, now spoken aloud by a barrister in a booming, theatrical voice, punctuated by murmurs from the gallery. It's hard to imagine the particular discomfort of that experience, grief made into spectacle, tenderness recited like evidence in a ledger. And yet, this discomfort served a purpose. The letters proved, beyond reasonable dispute, that a promise had existed. Mr. Ashworth's own barrister could hardly argue otherwise, given the plainness of his client's written words. Instead, the defense strategy in cases like this typically shifted toward a different argument entirely, suggesting that circumstances had changed sufficiently to justify breaking the engagement, or, in less charitable cases, quietly attempting to suggest the woman's own conduct had been somehow improper, a strategy that judges of the era, to their credit, often viewed with considerable skepticism. There's a particular detail worth lingering on here, something that appears again and again in the historical record of these cases: the role of female witnesses. Neighbors, friends, sometimes even servants, would be called to testify to what they had observed. A hand held a moment too long at a garden party, a particular tenderness of tone noticed during a shared carriage ride, the simple fact that a man had once introduced a woman as my intended within earshot of half the village. Imagine the particular, careful dignity required of these witnesses. Women, often themselves unmarried or of modest means, standing before a courtroom full of strangers, describing small moments of intimacy they had merely observed from a respectful distance. Their testimony carried real weight. Courts understood that female friends and neighbors were often the most reliable narrators of courtship's quiet, unspoken signals, the kind of details a man's own family might conveniently forget. In Margaret's case, as in so many like it, a neighbor testified to having seen Mr. Ashworth kneel, an old-fashioned but telling gesture, while presenting Margaret with the locket. Small, easily dismissed details in ordinary life. But under oath, in a courtroom, they became threads in a larger tapestry, each one reinforcing the central claim. A promise was made, plainly and repeatedly, and was broken without sufficient cause. When the jury finally returned their verdict, after, by most accounts, a surprisingly brief deliberation, they found in Margaret's favor. The damages awarded were substantial for the era, a sum that would have taken a schoolmaster's household years to accumulate through ordinary means. Picture the moment the verdict was read aloud. The particular stillness of a crowded room holding its breath, perhaps a soft exhale rippling through the gallery, the creak of wooden benches as spectators shifted, murmurs rising and falling like a tide. Margaret herself, we might imagine, sitting very still, her hands folded in her lap, the weight of 2 years of quiet humiliation finally, if imperfectly, acknowledged. It would be comforting to end the story here, tidy and resolved. But history rarely offers such clean endings. The money Margaret received, however substantial, could not undo the whispers that followed her afterward. The particular, quiet way small towns had of remembering a woman's public trial long after the details faded, of treating her forever after as the girl who sued. Financial vindication and social rehabilitation, it turns out, were not always the same thing. Still, there was something undeniably real in what Margaret had won. Not simply money, but acknowledgment. A public, legal recognition that a wrong had been done to her, spoken not in whispers behind closed doors, but declared plainly, in the formal language of the court, for anyone to hear. Quietly vindicated, quietly changed, and quietly, in her own modest way, remembered. But Margaret's case, for all its drama, was still relatively ordinary compared to what awaited certain other women whose breach of promise suits involved not schoolmasters and wool merchants, but names known across entire countries. There was one such case, on the other side of the Atlantic, that would capture the attention of an entire nation and reveal just how far these lawsuits could reach into the lives of the powerful. A case on the other side of the Atlantic, we said, one that captured the attention of an entire nation. So let's cross that ocean now, slowly, the way a ship might have, weeks of grey water, the creak of timber, gulls trailing behind for the first few days before falling away entirely. We arrive in the United States, sometime in the 1870s. A different country, a different legal system, built partly on English common law, but breach of promise suits had taken root here just as firmly. If anything, American juries were sometimes even more generous with their damages than their English counterparts, particularly when the man being sued was rich, or famous, or both. Picture a courtroom in a mid-sized American city, Boston perhaps, or Philadelphia, though the exact location matters less than the texture of the place. Gaslit chandeliers overhead, their light a little harsher than candlelight, a little more modern, a little more unforgiving. Reporters from several newspapers crowded onto benches with notebooks balanced on their knees, sharpening pencils, waiting. The woman at the center of this trial, we'll call her Josephine, was, by most accounts, an unusually accomplished young woman for her time. She had trained as a piano teacher, supported herself modestly through lessons given to the daughters of local families, and had, by the account of nearly everyone who knew her, a reputation for quiet respectability. This detail mattered enormously in cases like hers, because a woman's own conduct and character were always, unofficially, somewhat on trial alongside the defendant's broken promise. The man she sued, we'll call him Mr. Delacroix, was the son of a prominent merchant family, a man whose name appeared regularly in the business columns of the local papers. a man accustomed to a kind of easy public admiration that made the prospect of a public lawsuit particularly unwelcome to his family. Their courtship, as reconstructed through trial testimony, had begun at a charity concert, Josephine performing piano for an audience raising funds for a local orphanage, Mr. Delacroix seated in the third row, reportedly transfixed. It's a detail that appeared in several newspaper accounts of similar trials from this era. This particular romantic image of a man captivated by a woman's public performance. Perhaps embellished slightly for readers, perhaps not. But either way, it tells you something about what audiences of the time found compelling in these stories. What followed was a courtship conducted largely through letters and carefully supervised visits, not unlike Margaret's story from the section before. Though Josephine and Mr. Delacroix's correspondence, by the account of those who later read portions of it aloud in court, was considerably more extensive. Some later newspaper coverage claimed the pair exchanged well over 200 letters across the 18 months of their engagement, a staggering volume of paper and ink devoted to a single relationship, each letter carefully folded, sealed with wax, carried by hand or post between their two households. 200 letters. Sit with that number for a moment. Written by hand, by candlelight, likely late in the evening after the day's obligations were finished, the particular quiet scratch of a steel-nibbed pen on paper, the soft hiss of a wax seal being pressed closed, each one a small private ritual, repeated hundreds of times, never imagining that any of it might one day be read aloud to a room full of strangers. Mr. Delacroix's family, much like Margaret's suitor's family before them, grew uneasy as the engagement progressed. Josephine, for all her talent and her carefully maintained respectability, brought no significant fortune into a marriage. And so, gradually, the same familiar pattern unfolded, visits growing shorter, letters arriving less frequently, a distance opening up that no one named directly but that both parties surely felt. The end of the engagement, when it came, arrived with a particular cruelty that distinguished Josephine's case from many others. Rather than a quiet fading, or even a newspaper announcement, discovered second-hand, Mr. Delacroix reportedly ended the engagement through a letter delivered by a servant. A brief, formal note explaining that he had come to believe their differing circumstances made a happy marriage unlikely, and wishing her well in her future endeavors. There's something particularly chilling in the formality of that phrasing, isn't there? 2 years of devotion reduced to bureaucratic language about differing circumstances, delivered not even in his own hand to her directly, but passed along through a servant at the door, as though settling a minor business matter rather than ending a genuine engagement. Josephine, according to testimony later given by her sister, did not respond immediately with anger. She simply sat with the letter for several days, largely in silence before finally consulting a lawyer. Her case, when it went to trial, drew significant public attention, partly because of the Delacroix family's prominence, and partly because the sheer volume of correspondence between the two parties promised, to curious spectators and newspaper readers alike, an unusually vivid glimpse into a genuinely private relationship. The trial unfolded over the course of several days, an unusually long proceeding for a breach of promise case, owing largely to the volume of evidence involved. Josephine's lawyer read selected letters aloud, carefully chosen to demonstrate both the sincerity and the specificity of Mr. Delacroix's promises, passages in which he had written plainly of our future household and the day I make you my wife, phrases that left little room for the defense to argue that no genuine engagement had existed. Mr. Delacroix's lawyers, for their part, pursued a strategy that appeared with some regularity in cases involving wealthy defendants, arguing that circumstances beyond his client's control had made the marriage impractical, gesturing vaguely toward family business difficulties and shifting financial obligations, without ever directly denying that a promise had been made. It's worth pausing here to notice something particular about how juries of this era tended to respond to such arguments. Far from being sympathetic to claims of financial hardship or family pressure, Juries, often composed largely of ordinary working men, seemed to respond with a kind of quiet indignation toward wealthy defendants who used their family's disapproval as an excuse to abandon a woman of more modest means. If anything, invoking family wealth and status as a reason for breaking a promise sometimes seemed to backfire, reinforcing an impression of a powerful family callously discarding a woman they considered beneath them. Josephine herself, when called to testify, reportedly answered questions with the same quiet composure that had characterized her public piano performances, a detail newspapers seized upon eagerly, drawing a rather flattering contrast between her dignified restraint and what one paper described as the defendant's visibly uncomfortable demeanor throughout the proceedings. When the jury returned their verdict, they awarded Josephine damages substantially larger than what Margaret received in the case from our previous section, a sum reportedly equivalent to several years of a skilled tradesman's wages. Newspapers across the region carried detailed accounts of the verdict for days afterward, some sympathetic to Josephine, others more cynical, suggesting the case had simply provided entertaining courtroom theater for a public eager for scandal involving a prominent family. Picture the scene outside the courthouse afterward. A small crowd gathered on the steps, reporters calling out questions, a carriage waiting to carry Josephine quickly away from public view. It's a strange kind of victory, isn't it? One that arrives soaked in exactly the kind of public exposure a woman of that era would otherwise have worked so carefully to avoid. There's a particular, quiet irony worth sitting with here. The very mechanism that allowed women like Josephine and Margaret to seek justice, public testimony, published letters, newspaper coverage, was also the very thing that exposed them to renewed scrutiny and gossip. Justice, in this era, rarely arrived without a cost attached, even when the verdict favored the woman bringing the claim. And yet, for all its complications, something genuine had been accomplished. A wealthy, prominent family had been made to answer, in a public court of law, for the broken promise made to a piano teacher of modest means. However imperfectly, however painfully, the law had drawn no meaningful distinction between them. A promise was a promise, regardless of which family held more money or influence. Quietly vindicated, publicly exposed, and forever after known, whether she wished it or not, as the woman who had taken on the Delacroix name and won. But not every woman who brought such a suit found juries so sympathetic. There was a particular, quieter kind of case, one involving accusations not just of broken promises, but of something considerably more troubling, that reveals just how complicated, and sometimes how unjust, these trials could become when a woman's own reputation was called sharply into question. We left off with a promise that not every woman who brought a breach of promise suit found a courtroom so willing to believe her, that there was a quieter, harder kind of case, one where a woman's own reputation became the battlefield rather than the man's broken word. Let's ease into that story now, gently, the way you might ease into the last few pages of a book before finally setting it down for the night. Picture a smaller town this time, somewhere in the American Midwest, sometime in the 1880s, not a grand city courtroom with gaslit chandeliers, but a modest county courthouse, brick and plain, the kind with a single creaking staircase and a courtroom that smelled faintly of varnish and old paper. Outside, wind moved steadily through tall grass, and somewhere a church bell marked the hour with a flat, unhurried tone. The woman in this story, we'll call her Ruth, worked as a seamstress, taking in mending and dressmaking for families across the county. She was, by the account of neighbors who later testified, quiet, hard-working, and devout, attending church every Sunday without fail. Her fiancé, we'll call him Mr. Pratt, was a farmer of modest but respectable means, the kind of match that would have seemed, to any outside observer, entirely sensible and unremarkable. Their engagement lasted just over a year. There were no dramatic society announcements, no crowded ballrooms, none of the glittering trappings that surrounded Margaret's or Josephine's stories. Just quiet Sunday visits, a shared pew at church, and letters exchanged perhaps once a week, simpler, plainer letters than the ones we've read from before, written in the careful, slightly uneven hand of someone unaccustomed to much formal schooling. And then, without much warning, Mr. Pratt broke the engagement. What makes Ruth's case different? What makes it worth telling gently and worth telling last is the reason he gave. Rather than citing family disapproval or a shift in financial circumstances, Mr. Pratt claimed that Ruth's own conduct had been improper. He suggested, through his lawyer, that she had behaved with insufficient modesty during their courtship, hinting, without ever stating outright, that her character made her unsuitable as a wife. It's a particularly painful strategy, isn't it, when you sit with it a while? Rather than simply admitting he had changed his mind, Mr. Pratt attempted to shift the entire weight of the broken engagement onto Ruth's reputation, suggesting that she, not he, bore responsibility for the relationship's end. This was, historians have noted, a recognizable pattern in a meaningful number of breach of promise cases. A man wishing to avoid financial liability might attack the very thing a woman had spent her whole life protecting, her respectability. And once such an accusation was raised in open court, it rarely stayed confined to the specific facts of the case. It became instead a referendum on the woman's entire character, her entire life, laid open for a jury of strangers to judge. Imagine sitting in that courtroom as Ruth did, not simply defending the existence of a broken promise, but defending your own good name, in front of neighbors, in front of the very congregation you sat beside every Sunday. It's a particular, quiet kind of exposure, different from anything Margaret or Josephine has experienced. Their trials exposed private letters. Ruth's trial exposed her entire self to judgment. And yet, and this is worth sitting with gently, Ruth did not simply accept this framing in silence. Her lawyer called witness after witness, the minister of her church who testified to her faithful attendance and modest character, neighboring women who spoke plainly of her industriousness and quiet reputation. Even, in one particularly effective moment recorded in local newspaper accounts, the mother of a child Ruth had cared for during an illness, who described her simply as the kindest woman I have known. There is something almost unbearably tender in imagining that moment, a small community gathering, one by one, to speak on behalf of a woman whose name had been quietly threatened. Not grand gestures, not dramatic courtroom speeches, just ordinary people, standing up one after another, offering small, honest testimonies about a life lived carefully and well. The jury, in the end, sided with Ruth. They found that Mr. Pratt's accusations were unsupported and awarded her damages, a modest sum by the standards of Margaret's or Josephine's cases, but significant nonetheless for a farming community, and significant, too, in what it represented: a public, formal acknowledgement that her name had been wrongly attacked, and that the community itself did not believe the accusations leveled against her. It would be comforting to say Ruth's life afterward was entirely unmarked by the trial. Historical records suggest, more honestly, that some whispers followed her, regardless, the way whispers so often do, regardless of verdicts. But there is something quietly powerful, too, in knowing that when her name was put on trial, an entire community rose, gently and firmly, to defend it. Still respected, still known by her neighbors, still, in the end, believed. And so we come, slowly, to the end of tonight's journey. We began this evening with Eliza, mending a shirt by candlelight for a man who never returned. We traveled through Margaret's crowded London courtroom, through Josephine's 200 letters and her quiet piano performances, and finally through Ruth's small county courthouse, where an entire community stood, one witness at a time, to protect her good name. Different women, different decades, different corners of the world, and yet the same quiet thread running through each of their stories. A promise, spoken softly, in candlelight, or in letters, in ballrooms or church pews. And when that promise broke, each of these women found, however imperfectly, however painfully, a way to be heard. Think back for a moment to where we started. That small cottage window, the needle moving slowly through cotton, the candle burning low, the world outside quiet and dark. Somewhere in a drawer much like the one Eliza kept, There are still, perhaps, old letters folded into small squares, ribbons faded, ink gone soft and pale with age, small, private evidence of promises once made, in a world that, however imperfectly, once tried to hold people to their word. The candle is burning low now. The room around you is quiet. Perhaps your own eyes are growing heavy, the way eyes do at the end of a long, gentle story. If this story kept you company tonight, you're welcome to like or subscribe, but only if it felt worth it. No pressure at all, ret now. Let the letters stay folded, the ribbons stay tied, the candle finally go out, sleep well.